Hello, my name is Kelley Vlahos, and I am the editor-in-chief of Responsible Statecraft. I am here to welcome you to a very special webinar, Kennedy's Coup, How Diem's Assassination Became Our Foreign Policy Albatross. My name, as I said, was Kelley, and I am the editor of Responsible Statecraft, again, published by the Quincy Institute. If you are not familiar with our organization, it is a think tank focused on reorienting U.S. foreign policy away from its perennial search for monsters to destroy and towards diplomacy and non-militarized engagement with the rest of the world. We do this through policy expertise, advocacy, and providing a platform for realist and restraint-minded writers and scholars on responsiblestatecraft.org, and I hope you will check us out. So, why do I call this webinar special? Well, all Quincy webinars endeavor to hit off the latest headlines, but today has the extraordinary benefit of providing a time machine to a moment in history before the biggest failure in U.S. foreign policy in the 20th century, the Vietnam War. But it also forges a playbook for future administrations to justify dangerous strategic pursuits like regime change and so-called preventative war for higher ideological goals. In 1963, the goal was stopping the spread of communism, aka the domino theory. In 2003, it was stopping the spread of radical Islam, aka the global war on terror. The historical record has not been kind to the judgments made in either war, Vietnam or Iraq. Nevertheless, we have an administration today that in the course of 1 month abducted Venezuela's president and is actively seeking to force the current regimes in Cuba, if not Iran too, out of power. Today's webinar seeks to ask the question, what are the dynamics in each administration that cause them to ignore pragmatic, rational, realist counsel in order to choose the most escalatory, radical path instead? Why do all the cast of characters seem the same? Is failure in this sense a feature, not merely a bug of U.S. foreign policy? Author Jack Cheevers, also a veteran newspaperman at the Los Angeles Times for many years, has done a superlative deep dive into the historic and political currents in both Saigon and in Washington that led to the coup and assassination of Diem and his brother New on November 2nd, 1963, just 20 days before the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in Dallas. Cheevers' book, Kennedy's Coup, A White House Plot, a Saigon Murder, and America's Descent into Vietnam, was released today, and I am so proud to be the first to platform it publicly. Joining me to talk about the book and ask a few questions about the context, which I have to say is absolutely riveting in terms of the insights into military strategy of that period too, as well as the raging political and religious factions inside and the rivalries inside the Kennedy White House, is Arturo Jimenez-Bacardi, who is a research fellow at the National Security Archive in Washington, D.C. He just completed a digital National Security Archive set of 2,500 declassified documents called CIA Covert Operations, the Truman Years, 1946 to 1953, which will be published in the spring. His most recent article for the National Security Archive is Imperial Prerogative, How the Panama Invasion and the Barr Doctrine Set the Stage for Maduro, the Maduro Snatch Operation. So thank you, audience, for being here with me today, and thank you to our two outstanding panelists for this discussion, Jack Cheevers and Arturo Jimenez-Bacardi. I'm so glad that you're here with me today. I am going to, I think, start with a little table setting. Jack, I would love for you to basically lay out for our viewers who may not be familiar with the history of Diem, his coup and assassination in 1963. The book is extremely comprehensive, more than 600 pages. So I know it'll be difficult to get to every detail and nuance, but would you at least explain the basic time period you cover here? Who Diem and his family were in the context of Vietnamese history, the war with the Viet Cong and the communists in the north, as well as the conflicts with the Buddhist population in Vietnam. And most importantly, why was there even a question as to why he had to go?
Well, again, Kelley, thank you so much for inviting me, and thanks for that terrific introduction. My book covers the period from 1954 to 1965, and in South Vietnam primarily, and in Washington as well. And Diem and his family were very influential figures in South Vietnam during most of that period, up until the point where he was assassinated in 1963. And he was a longtime nationalist. He had fought against French colonialism for decades earlier in his life. He was an ardent Catholic, and one of his brothers was the Catholic Archbishop of Hue. Another brother was the sort of the unofficial governor of Hue and the provinces around it. And his younger brother, Nu, was his chief political advisor, his closest confidant, and was also in charge of the secret police, the feared South Vietnamese special forces, and the clandestine Can Lao Party. He was a very Machiavellian figure, was working things behind the scenes, and was very much feared. And his wife was the now infamous Madame Nu, also known as the Dragon Lady, and she was known as the Dragon Lady for wielding her power. She was a member of the National Assembly in South Vietnam. She was also the head of her own paramilitary army of women. She had a very sharp tongue and was very critical of people in Diem's government as well as the Americans at the time. So Diem came to power in 1954, when he was appointed prime minister. The following year, he ascended to president of South Vietnam, so he was the chief of state, and basically had complete control of the country, ruled in a fairly authoritarian manner. And for a while, he was able to hold the country together. It had been very damaged during the long 8-year-long French war between the French and Ho Chi Minh's guerrilla army, then known as the Viet Minh. But he was starting to gain an upper hand on the country toward the late 50s, and was becoming very well known and very popular in the United States. And you asked why he had to go. President Kennedy was a longtime supporter of Diem. He had met him in 1953 at a lunch. Was a very strong supporter of Diem in South Vietnam when he was during his Senate years in the 1950s. And when he was president, when he became president, Diem came to him and asked for help in fighting what was becoming a more and more serious insurgency by the Viet Cong, who were sort of the successors to the communist-led Viet Minh guerrilla army. And Kennedy responded with a massive program of military and economic assistance. The military part of it was called Operation Beef Up, and Kennedy sent thousands of U.S. combat advisors, along with large quantities of U.S. weaponry, helicopters, tanks, artillery, fixed-wing aircraft, napalm, all sorts of arms, to help Diem beat back the Viet Cong. You asked why did he have to go? What happened between him and Kennedy was by 1963, not only was he kind of dragging this reputation as an increasingly repressive, increasingly authoritarian leader, but he also faced an uprising by the Buddhist monks and nuns in South Vietnam. The Buddhists claimed that he was persecuted, that his government was persecuting them, and by restricting them and flying their religious flags and making it more difficult for them to buy land for their pagodas and their schools and so forth. Some of their claims were exaggerated. Some of their claims were unfounded. In a lot of ways, Buddhism had actually flourished under Diem. A lot of pagodas had been built in the late 50s, for example. But he started to get this reputation as anti-Buddhist at the time. The Buddhists constituted 70% of the population in South Vietnam, about 14 million people in total population, and about 70% of them consider themselves at least nominally Buddhist. So it was a very large majority. And things started to heat up in May of 1963 when Diem's security forces massacred 8 Buddhists during a protest in Hue. They heated up even further in June when a Buddhist monk, an elderly monk, drenched himself in gasoline and burned himself to death in the middle of a Saigon intersection. And there was an American news photographer there at the time who took a picture of that. It became one of the most famous news photos ever taken of the burning monk. And it wound up on the front page of probably hundreds of newspapers in the US and around the world the next day. And so now Diem was viewed as both a repressive leader and a religious bigot. So it became more and more problematic for Kennedy to support him. He was starting to face criticism from the US Congress, from the US press. And the breaking point, I think, for Kennedy came in August of that year, 1963, when Diem sent his troops and his police into Buddhist pagodas in Saigon, Hue, Da Nang, and elsewhere in South Vietnam, and they wound up arresting about 1,400 monks and nuns, in some cases very bloodily and very roughly. And Diem's goal was to decapitate the Buddhist protest movement, which he did successfully, but at the same time, he triggered this global outpouring of criticism of him, reinforced his reputation as a religious bigot. And at that time, it became very problematic for Kennedy to continue to support him. And that's the point, I think, at which Kennedy started to think of that he might have to be removed.
Thank you, Jack. I mean, and I appreciate how difficult it was for you to get from point A to point B there, because there is just so much in this history. And I'd just like to remind folks on the call, if you do have any questions for Jack or Arturo or myself, please put them in the Q&A. We'll be trying to save some time at the end of the event to get to audience questions. Arturo is going to help me ask Jack about his book, and I'm going to hand it over to you next, Arturo. Oh, you're on mute.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, perfect. So thank you, and thanks for having me. So to stick with the role of Kennedy, so the title of your great book is called Kennedy's Coup. And yet throughout the book, you never explicitly place President Kennedy in the anti-Diem or the pro-coup camp, right? One of the interesting things about this case is that the Kennedy administration, Kennedy officials are so divided among each other. There's a clear pro-Diem camp that doesn't want to see Diem overthrown, and there's a clear anti-Diem camp. So the leaders of the anti-Diem camp that you highlight the most are Roger Hilsman of the State Department, and then Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., who becomes the U.S. ambassador to Vietnam during the Buddhist crisis in 1963. And so Hilsman plays a major role in your book because he is the author of what historians now consider to be this infamous Department of State telegram called Deptel 243, or the green light telegram. And so Hilsman in August essentially writes this telegram where he is placing these conditions on Diem that he knows Diem will never accept, including removing his brother Nu from power. And he starts ordering Saigon U.S. Embassy officials to start looking for alternatives to Diem and to start making contacts with South Vietnamese generals, signaling that the U.S. would be open to a regime change operation. And so the Hilsman and Lodge are at the head of this anti-Diem camp. The pro-Diem factions are the outgoing U.S. ambassador to Vietnam, Frederick Nolting, the lead U.S. military commander in South Vietnam, General Harkins, the head of the CIA, John McCone, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Maxwell Taylor, the CIA station chief in Saigon, John Richardson. But when it comes to Kennedy, you don't describe him clearly as either pro-coup or anti-coup. You use more adjectives like he's indecisive or he's wavering. At times he's naive or he delegates too much power to Lodge. And so my question is, would it be fair to present Kennedy as clearly in the anti-Diem and even broadly supportive of the pro-coup camp, in the sense that whenever Kennedy has to make a difficult decision, more often than not, he takes a position that undermines Diem and makes a coup more likely. So at the end of the day, it is Kennedy that approves the infamous Deptel 243, and he never takes any steps to block it. He picks Lodge, and he gives Lodge these marching orders to try to find alternatives to Diem. And Kennedy will also give these speeches, public speeches, that he knows South Vietnamese generals are listening, where he's critical of Diem. And so the only time that Kennedy was clearly opposed to the coup is he would say he's opposed to a coup only if it's going to fail. And that's probably an unrealistic position to take because nobody can guarantee that a coup is going to work. But wouldn't it be fair to describe Kennedy as clearly anti-Diem and broadly pro-coup, but he had to manage a very divided cabinet?
Well, when the paperback edition comes out, I may have to rewrite it or try to take into consideration that, and make it more explicit that, Kennedy's position. But I think that I was trying to get across some nuances in his position. I think it's correct as you stated that, he was pretty much pro-coup from the get-go. But I think it was a very reluctant support for the coup. I think he had a lot of doubts about what was going to happen. And don't forget, he liked and admired Diem. I don't think, he never wanted to see Diem killed. He never wanted to see that outcome. But he, at the same time, as you pointed out, he never put the brakes on the whole thing. And so, the first sign of that was his approval of the green light telegram, as you laid out. That was a very important document. And that thing was basically thrown together by Roger Hilsman on a summer Saturday. And it was sent up to Kennedy. He was vacationing with his family on Cape Cod that weekend. And most of his senior advisors were also on vacation or out of town. Robert McNamara, the defense secretary, was climbing mountains in Wyoming. Dean Rusk was taking in a Yankees game and going to UN meetings in New York. John McCone, the CIA director, was yachting in Puget Sound. So Kennedy, he wasn't able to get the full range of advice that he probably should have gotten on whether or not to send it. But, in a matter of hours, he did approve sending the green light cable to Henry Cabot Lodge, who was the U.S. ambassador in Saigon at the time. And that basically enmeshed the U.S. government in the general's conspiracy. They had been plotting. U.S. intelligence came across the plot in July, the month before, the green light cable. But the cable pulled the U.S. government right, pretty much into the coup. And as things unfolded, Kennedy's doubts became clear. The cable itself triggered weeks of very often bitter and angry debate at the White House between the two, the pro and con camps, as you pointed out. Kennedy's concern was a very kind of myopic, narrowly focused concern, which was whether or not the rebel generals had the military power to overwhelm Diem's forces. And U.S. intelligence said that the two sides were pretty much equal in Saigon, and that probably fed his doubts anymore. And I have no doubt that in the back of his mind was the Bay of Pigs debacle. He did not want to have a repeat of that in Saigon. And I'm sure a lot of folks on the webinar will recall the Bay of Pigs CIA-trained Cuban exiles tried to invade Cuba with the goal of taking down Fidel Castro, overthrowing his government. And Castro's military forces met them on the beaches, the invasion beaches, and pretty much captured or killed pretty much all of them. So Kennedy, he realized the same thing could happen in Saigon. And, he told his advisors at one point the worst outcome from this whole thing would be a failed coup, because it would be a repeat of the Bay of Pigs if the generals failed to overpower Diem. So, things went along. The debate continued. What was remarkable to me in listening to the tapes of some of these discussions in the Oval Office in the cabinet room at the White House, that were secretly taped by JFK at the time, was how little discussion was devoted to some of the significant longer range questions that were raised by a coup. For instance, if the general succeeded in toppling Diem, who was going to replace him? Would the replacement be any better, do any better job in governing South Vietnam? Would the replacement would be any more effective at prosecuting the war against the Viet Cong? There was some discussion of those issues, but it was remarkably scarce and superficial. But again, as you pointed out, Kennedy was always in favor of the coup. I think the level of his support waxed and waned over time as he considered all the con arguments that came from people like McNamara and John McCone and Maxwell Taylor, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs at the time. But he could have put the brakes on it at any time, especially early in the process. He could have gone to the generals and said, conveyed the message through Henry Cabot Lodge that we've decided we're going to stick with him. We think he's the best option to defeat the Viet Cong. And if you do overthrow them, we're going to cancel all American support for South Vietnam. I think that would have stopped the generals in their tracks because they realized how heavily dependent they were on U.S. dollars and U.S. guns. But he never did that. And, right through the entire, summer and fall of '63, he kept going. He didn't back down from the coup, and he was a supporter of it all the way through the process. Hence the title of my book, Kennedy's Coup.
Thanks, Jack. I have a follow-up to that, and what I found fascinating, because you're talking about folks who were pro-coup, like Lodge and Hillsman and Bundy and others. And then you have this other cast of characters like Fritz Nolting, the original, or not original, but the ambassador, the U.S. ambassador, when we come on the scene around 1960 in the book, who was very sympathetic to Diem, had been sort of had a more of an intimate relationship with him, and was part of this faction that believed that if we continued to support him and continued facilitating diplomacy in this regard, that I don't want to say victory, but improvements on the battlefield were just around the corner. And we've heard that in our more recent wars in Afghanistan. Victory is always just one step away. We just got to hang in there. And so we had the voices of Nolting and Maxwell Taylor, as well as General Harkins, who were really warning Kennedy that if the generals were allowed to overthrow Diem, that there would be a hastening or a loss on the battlefield, that there are too much factionalism and politics layered in Saigon itself, that they could not guarantee that order would be maintained in Saigon, that there would be a better, more democratic administration waiting in the wings. And in order to win this war against the Viet Cong, we needed that stabilizing force in Diem. On the other hand, the others like Lodge and Canning and Hillsman were saying the opposite. They were saying that they will never win this war if we don't get rid of this guy. It sounded like Kennedy had been more or less convinced towards the end there of the latter. And I have Dave Kaiser, who is the author of American Tragedy, Kennedy, Johnson, and the Origins of the Vietnam War, in our audience right now. And he wanted to ask you a little bit about that the idea that the war could not be won with Diem still in power. It sounded like Kennedy was convinced of that. My question is, was that the right assumption given what happened afterwards? And can you talk a little bit about assumptions and how the Vietnam War was actually touched off because of this vacuum, the security vacuum, and the two more coups that occurred after Diem was overthrown?
Well, first of all, hello, David. Thanks for joining this fantastic book that you wrote. As I mentioned earlier, there was very little thought given to what was South Vietnam going to look like after this coup. All the focus was on, is Diem going to win or lose? Are the generals going to prevail or not? And then the coup went down, and it was interesting to me that John McCone, that the CIA director, was very prophetic in the way he spelled out what was going to happen after the coup. He predicted that there would be there'd be a period of great political turmoil and instability, followed by a second coup, followed by more political instability. And he was worried that the Viet Cong could actually win the war during that interregnum. And that's exactly what happened. The generals took power. They were in power for about 3 months. They were very inept. They were incapable of governing South Vietnam, as Kennedy had been warned a number of times. And they were removed themselves in the second coup, which took place in January of 1964 by another general, who then tried to preside over the country for the next 12 months, actually beyond that, and didn't do a particularly good job. The Buddhist uprising continued, the Buddhist agitation continued, the VC continued to make battlefield gains, and things were not looking particularly good for the South Vietnamese army or government. In terms of assumptions, presidents are faced with lots of very, very difficult calls. They often have to make decisions based on very scanty information. Kennedy complained constantly during the summer and fall of '63 that he didn't have enough information to make a good decision on the coup, but he kind of went along with it because there were, he just decided that was the best option. That was the lesser of two evils, really, I think. You could see the same thing in the Iraq War. The Bush government went into Iraq with thinking it was an invasion on the cheap. They weren't going to send in as many soldiers as they should have. They had no post-war planning for how were they going to reconstruct Iraq, how were they going to rebuild the government. They went in and fired all the officers in the Iraqi army, who quickly got together and launched their own insurgency against the U.S. occupiers. These things are very tricky. And now we're faced with a situation with Trump and Maduro. Lord knows what's going to happen in Venezuela.
That's a great point. Arturo?
So I guess to stick with this theme on the role of the United States in the coup. So since the day after the coup, so the day after, on November 3rd, 1963, U.S. government officials have always been adamant that the U.S. did not play a direct role in the November coup. Now, over the years, several U.S. officials, and your book clearly shows that at a minimum, the U.S. created the conditions for a coup. And at a minimum, it was U.S. policy not to prevent a coup or get in the way of these coup plotting South Vietnamese generals. And of course, the U.S. in the past had saved Diem and had intervened and made sure that coups didn't happen. And in the future, the U.S. also in Vietnam would, deter coups from taking place. Now, so after since you've read so many documents, I'm particularly interested in trying to assess this, the degree of involvement that the U.S. was in, and in particular looking at the role of Lucien Conein, who was this low-level CIA official, and he became the main liaison for the CIA and the U.S. government to communicate with the coup plotting generals. And historians have always had a big challenge figuring out Conein, in part because you can't trust anything he says, right? So Stanley Carno very famously, or not very famously, but he was working on a biography for Conein, and he gave it up because he couldn't confirm any of Conein's stories. And over the years, Conein has given different accounts. But you've actually gotten declassified a number of documents from Conein, including one of his after-action reports. And so we do know that Conein, on the day of the coup on November 1st, gave the coup plotting generals something like $46,000 to bribe any South Vietnamese military officers that might be opposed to the coup. And so I guess what's your take on, after having looked at so many documents, what kind of a role did the U.S. play in a spectrum from just creating conditions to playing a more direct or decisive role in what eventually becomes the overthrow and assassination of Diem?
Well, I think this might be, to some extent, an issue of semantics. What's an indirect role? What's a direct role? I would argue that the U.S. government role was arm's length. I think it was indirect in the sense that the U.S. government didn't plan the coup, didn't participate in the execution of the coup. No American personnel or equipment were used in the coup. But as you just pointed out, the U.S. government richly fertilized the soil in which the coup plot grew. And it's the generals might have gone ahead on their own. They might not have gone ahead on their own. But I think with that covert encouragement, it was very clear that the U.S. government was giving them permission to get rid of Diem. They went forward with the coup. Conan is a fascinating character, kind of still an enigma. I can see why Stanley Carno gave up on trying to write a book and confirm all his crazy stories. But his personnel record was released as part of the JFK assassination records, multiple document dumps that have happened in fairly recent years. And he was born in Paris. He had been sent as a child to the United States, grew up in the United States, and fought in both the American and the French armies during World War II. Late in the war, he was recruited by the Office of Special Services and trained as a guerrilla to fight behind the lines, first in German-occupied France and later in Japanese-occupied Vietnam. And during that period in Vietnam, he got to know a lot of young Vietnamese military officers who, by 1963, were running the South Vietnamese army. They'd risen to the level of generals, and they knew Conan. They'd fought alongside Conan in the war. They'd been drinking in bars and nightclubs with Conan for years, and they trusted him. They didn't trust most of the Americans, but they really trusted Conan, and they insisted that he be the sole conduit of information between them and the U.S. Embassy, which he did. And he was very closely supervised by Henry Cabot Lodge. And he was the guy who carried messages back and forth between the generals and Lodge in the run-up to the coup. So was that a direct role, an indirect role? I don't know. You have to be the judge of that. In terms of the money he gave the generals, they asked him to come to the coup headquarters on the day of the coup and bring as much cash with him as he could pull together. So the CIA wound up giving him initially giving him 3 million piastres, and he had that in a briefcase or a satchel, and he showed up at the headquarters. That was worth about $42,000 at the official exchange rate. Was worth probably triple that at the black market rate at the time, let's say $100,000 or $105,000. And he gave the money to the generals. They said they wanted to use it, as you pointed out, to bribe fence straddlers, and also to pay families of soldiers who were killed in the uprising. What happened to the money is anyone's guess. I have no idea what happened to it, but I don't regard that as a decisive factor in the coup at all. I mean, to me, it's a footnote in the coup. The coup was in motion, literally in motion at that point. Did he have a direct role in the coup by giving them money? I don't think that was nearly enough incentive for them to stage the coup. They had many other reasons, and as I say, the coup was already underway literally at the time he delivered that money to them.
Thanks, Jack. I have a question from a Michael Bryans in the audience, and I think it encapsulates the whole theme of this afternoon's event. I had written a review of your book that came out in Responsible Statecraft yesterday that essentially said that the events, the assassination of Diem and his brother, the overthrow of his government, had touched off a series of events that led to the expansion of the war and the full-on deployment of U.S. forces in the War of Vietnam, leading to more than 58,000 deaths of U.S. servicemen and millions of civilians in that war. Michael Bryan says, prove it. Like, why did Diem's coup and assassination ultimately lead to the Vietnam War that we know now and the tragedy that was in U.S. foreign policy?
Well, that's a great question. And I don't really think there's a direct cause and effect connection between the coup and the big U.S. buildup in 1965 under Lyndon Johnson. I think the coup, however, was a very important event in a chain of events that led to the U.S. involvement in the war, the deep involvement in the war in 1965. And the reason I say that is that the coup effectively decapitated what was a pretty stable South Vietnamese government in the early 60s. I mean, obviously the Buddhists there was a lot of turmoil coming from the Buddhists, but Diem did a pretty good job in stamping out the Buddhist protest movement by the fall of 63. So you had a stable government going into November when he and his brother were murdered, and all of a sudden you had a leaderless government, which was then taken over by a number of generals who were incompetent. They were replaced by another general who was incapable of governing South Vietnam. And South Vietnam just kind of spiraled into political chaos. And by August of 1964, for instance, Buddhists and Catholics were fighting in the streets. Religious warfare had broken out in the country, which the general who was then running the country, General Win Khan, was unable to control. I mean, the Buddhists and Catholics were fighting each other in the streets with clubs and knives and rocks and hand grenades, and it was a very bloody struggle. And between the time of the Diem coup and the time that South Vietnam finally stabilized in 1965 under Thieu and Key, there were 7 different governments rose and fell in South Vietnam during that period. 7 different governments. And there was so much. So Kennedy is assassinated. Lyndon Johnson takes over, and he's facing this turmoil, this instability. The Viet Cong are making battlefield gains. By the end of 1964, the North Vietnamese army is starting to infiltrate units into the South, and so forth. And his generals, the Pentagon, everyone in the Pentagon is saying, you've got to send ground troops in. You've got to send American troops in. You've got to start bombing the North. He was very reluctant to do that, argued with his advisors for months and months and months, and finally caved in because I think he was so frustrated by the instability and the inability of the South Vietnamese government and army to pull itself together. He felt that the U.S. had to literally take over the war. And so by the end of 1965, there were 185,000 American ground troops in South Vietnam. And the rest is history, as we all know. I mean, by 1968, there were 500,000 American troops there, and we still wound up suffering huge casualties and losing the war.
Right. And, as you wrote, after JFK's assassination, Johnson administration takes over, the Viet Cong is I think you said, seizing the initiative in key provinces. And then they start attacking U.S. service members and assets in the region. So it's like they're directly, they're instigating. And it becomes more difficult for Johnson to turn to his advisors and say, we don't want to engage this strategic bombing campaign that you want in the North, but like service members are getting killed. This news is flashed home. Coffins are arriving. I mean, it seems like he was really under the gun because maybe before that time, the battlefield was a mess, but they weren't striking so close to home.
Right. Yeah. And I think just in general, the world had become a much more dangerous place by the end of 1964. The Chinese had successfully detonated their first atomic weapon. The Soviets had just ousted Khrushchev, and with him, his policy of peaceful coexistence with the West. Both of those things happened in October of 1964. And Johnson was elected by a landslide against Barry Goldwater the following month. But I think, he was clearly aware that the geopolitical situation was becoming more dangerous. And it was very interesting because Johnson, during the campaign, posed as the peace candidate against the nuclear hawk, Barry Goldwater, and tried to portray him as this trigger-happy guy who wouldn't hesitate to start a nuclear war with the Soviets or the Chinese. Throughout the campaign, he kept repeating the line that he wasn't going to escalate the war in Vietnam. His quote was that I'm not going to send American boys to do the job of Asian boys. And his position was that it's South Vietnam's war to win or lose. We're going to support them with advisors and equipment and money, but we're not going to send in ground troops. And I think he just gradually he gradually moved away from that position under pressure from Robert McNamara and other people in the Pentagon who were just saying, we're going to lose the war unless we put American boots on the ground and essentially take over the war. And eventually he caved into those arguments, and by March of 65, he had sent the Marines into Da Nang, the first American combat troops into Da Nang, and launched Operation Rolling Thunder, which was the strategic bombing campaign against North Vietnam that stretched over the next 3.5 years, dropped hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs on the North, and wasn't particularly effective.
I never saw withdrawal as a potential option, unfortunately. Arturo?
Yeah, to add on this Diem thing, or the pivotal role that Diem played and how significant overthrowing him might have been to the future instability of Vietnam, is something that you show in your book. Also, is that the National Liberation Front and North Vietnam wanted to see Diem removed and undermined, and there were even double agents among some high-ranking Vietnamese military officers that were conspiring to try to get Diem overthrown as well. So if the adversary in particular saw that as a potential big win, it's kind of ironic that the United States would also pursue that position. But so my question is more, so the Diem coup, of course, was not just a coup. Both Diem and his brother were also assassinated. And you describe quite vividly in your book that one of the key South Vietnamese coup plotting generals, General Big Minh, he's the one that gives the order to assassinate both Diem and Nhu by raising his fingers to one of his security guards. And so emphasizing here that it's not just a coup, but it was also an assassination. And maybe taking this long view, this operation we might term it, as other scholars that have looked at U.S. assassination policy, as either an example of the U.S. outsourcing an assassination, or perhaps maybe more accurately, what some scholars call an inadvertent assassination, something which, the U.S. operation against Maduro, the U.S. was considered that it might become an inadvertent assassination. I think inadvertent assassination might be in the news again if the U.S. decides to carry out certain operations in Iran. And so what I mean by inadvertent assassination is that, of course, encouraging the military, the South Vietnamese military, to overthrow a government, and there's going to be quite a bit of violence that's used in order to overthrow a government. And you also know that several of these South Vietnamese coup plotting generals probably want to see Diem gone. They don't want him to stick around and potentially organize a counter coup. And the U.S. government never takes any active steps to try to make sure that Diem is not murdered, that he's moved away into exile. So my question is, how responsible do you see the U.S. role for not overthrowing Diem, but for his eventual assassination? And how responsible should we hold Kennedy for that outcome as well, given that he was warned on numerous occasions that this could be a possibility.
Well, I think if you were going to hand out indictments over the coup, you would definitely indict the U.S. government as a co-conspirator. You would definitely indict President Kennedy as a major co-conspirator. The U.S. government and Kennedy didn't pull the trigger, but they certainly put a couple of bullets in the gun. And I think that Kennedy and his advisors in the White House, the leadership of his administration, they bear a large degree of responsibility for this, for sure. And but I think at the same time, Kennedy I think Kennedy was very naive about the possible outcome of the coup. As I said earlier, he liked Diem. He had met Diem before. He admired Diem. Diem was a fellow Catholic head of state. Kennedy at one point stated that he hoped that if the coup was successful, that Diem and New would only be sent into exile. He didn't want to see them killed. And he expressed great surprise when they actually were killed. He was in a meeting at the White House the day after the coup, and somebody brought in news that Diem and New had been killed. And they weren't just killed; they were butchered. I mean, they were brutally slaughtered in the back of a U.S. supplied armored personnel carrier. They were bayoneted. New was bayoneted 30 times. Both of them were shot to death. It was very ugly sort of killing. And somebody brought news to Kennedy, and he was so shocked by this that, according to Maxwell Taylor, he jumped up out of his chair with a look of expression, a look of shock on his face that Taylor had never seen before, and rushed out of the room. And after he left, Taylor looked at the other advisors in the room and remarked laconically, "What did he expect?" I mean, there was a very good chance that in a violent overthrow of your government by your own military, which expressed itself in the form of a lengthy siege on your palace with tanks and artillery and aircraft, there was a really good chance that you were going to die in that process. But Kennedy seemed surprised by that. I think he knew that Diem was in danger. Earlier in the fall, he had secretly sent one of his friends, a personal friend. It was a Massachusetts congressman named Torbert McDonald, who had been one of Kennedy's roommates at Harvard. And he sent McDonald secretly to Saigon to meet with Diem, and McDonald urged Diem to seek asylum at the U.S. Embassy, which Diem was never going to do. He was too staunch a nationalist. He'd spent his entire career trying to throw foreign, occupiers and foreign influence out of Vietnam. He was never going to accept that sort of offer, and he turned it down. But I think that indicates that Kennedy was, to some extent, he was aware that Diem was in danger. But like you say, there was no effort to protect him, to get him out of the palace when it came under fire, put him on a U.S. aircraft and fly him to New York and keep him in exile for the rest of his life. I don't know how practical that would be, once the siege of his palace started. But nobody even talked about it, never even tried to do it.
Yeah, Jack, I have a question/comment from a Ken Hughes in the Q&A that kind of speaks to this. He says that when UVA's Miller Center transcribed the Kennedy tapes from the coup period, Ken himself examined the various claims that JFK had insisted on Diem's safety. None of them stood up to scrutiny. Instead, he found that JFK had multiple opportunities to make Diem's safety a condition for American support for a coup, but he never took any of them. Did not grant him political asylum before the coup, and only suggested support for the coup plotters if a coup failed and they would need asylum. Do you think that the history is a little muddy there? Because I see you grappling with this in the book, that Kennedy seems to be going in one direction, and then when he talks to advisors, he goes in another. He never excoriates Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., when he literally does not pass on information, outright lies, seemingly takes things into his own hands from the embassy. There is a moment that it just made me angry when Henry Cabot Lodge thwarts the asylum of Diem's brother. This is after the assassination, and I'm sorry, his name is Khan. He was the brother who was
Right.
a despicable guy. He had been, running Hugh with an iron fist. But, Kennedy's administration had facilitated his escape, and Henry Cabot Lodge insisted that he came back and was turned over to the generals, and then he was executed. And then Henry Cabot Lodge lied about it to the press. Kennedy had to have known the duplicity of his ambassador, but he never puts him on the coals for this. And even afterwards, Henry Cabot Lodge, sort of washes his hands of the whole affair, and he's asked. He remains the ambassador. He's asked to help the new generals now in control of the government, and he sort of shrugs off, looks puzzled, remote, is more concerned about his own presidential bid. So, what do you say to this? That Kennedy it's complicated.
It's very complicated, as you just laid out. And I mean, Henry Cabot Lodge, clearly a very key player in this whole thing, very strongly anti-Diem from the get-go. I think Kennedy was acted kind of deferentially toward Lodge because he thought Lodge might be the Republican nominee for president in '64, and he liked Lodge. I mean, he had beaten Lodge a couple of times. He'd beaten him in a Senate race in Massachusetts. He'd beaten him, of course, when he was Nixon's running mate in 1960. But they liked each other. They enjoyed each other's company, and Kennedy appointed Lodge as his South Vietnam ambassador. But Bobby Kennedy argued strongly against that and said, you're not going to be able to control this guy. He's a loner. He marches to the beat of his own drum, and you're going to lose control of him. And Kennedy pretty much did lose control of him. He disobeyed orders. Even though the White House had ordered him to get No Din Khan and his mother, his nonagenarian mother out of Vietnam safely, he refused to do that and wound up turning Khan over to the generals who put him on trial and executed him 6 months later. So, Lodge was his own guy. I mean, he was a very prominent Republican. He was used to getting his own way. He was used to giving orders. He was actually a reserve general in the Army. And he just, he resisted Kennedy in some key ways.
Arturo?
Yeah, it's hard for me to move away from this theme on assassination, and in particular, Ken Hughes. One of the things that I remember so vividly from one of these great articles is that in one of these tapes, when Kennedy is warned about the possibility that Diem might be assassinated, Kennedy doesn't say anything. Sometimes there's moments where he's completely opposed, but at other times when these issues come up, he doesn't seem to be that bothered by the possibility. But since we're running out of time, there's another major theme that I really enjoyed in your book that I really enjoyed, and it connects with Lodge, and that's the role of the press. And so the role of the press, just like the U.S. government was deeply divided between a pro-Diem camp and an anti-Diem camp, what comes out in your book is that the press is the same way. There's a clear anti-Diem camp led by Halberstam and Neil Shaheen, and then there's a pro-Diem camp by Marguerite Higgins and Alsop and others. But then when we tie Lodge into this, one of the things that you really highlight, and I think add a lot of context to the historical record, is Lodge's role at manipulating the press. Lodge was a master manipulator and a master at strategic leaking to the press. And he really won over the Halberstams and the Neil Shaheens, who were so fed up with Diem censorship and who were so frustrated with Nolting. And so, but what I was left with, so on the one hand, Halberstam is very admirable because he wanted to expose U.S. lies, and there were a lot of U.S. lies. But on the other hand, you also present that they kind of got used by Lodge in Lodge's policy preference, or those that were wanting to overthrow Diem, Hilsman, and others that were using these strategic leaks. And so there seems to be this cautionary tale for journalists when it comes to taking these pro and or anti positions.
Yeah, and that's all true, Arturo. And Lodge's approach to the press was contrasted very sharply with Nolting's approach to the press. Nolting was his immediate predecessor as U.S. ambassador, and Nolting disliked the press. He argued with the reporters all the time. He got in a big screaming match with David Halberstam in his office one day, and Halberstam wound up leaving his office. Lodge was much more sophisticated. For one thing, he had been a journalist early in his career in Boston and New York. He'd been a newspaper reporter and editor, and he knew how to work the press. And he'd been doing it since the early 50s when he was managing Eisenhower's first campaign for the presidency. He was leaking to people like Joe Alsop all the time. He knew exactly how to do it. And so he arrived in Saigon with a game plan for winning over the press. And it was basically I think a matter of confirmation bias. At that point, both Lodge and the reporters in Saigon were both opposed to Diem rather. And so when David Halberstam would discuss all the things that he thought were wrong with Diem and his army, Lodge would nod in agreement, and he would throw in all his reasons for disliking Lodge and his army. So all of a sudden, Lodge rather started getting much more kid glove treatment from the press in Saigon than Nolting ever had. Nolting had been a target for the press for in a number of instances. But you talked about the division between in the American press, and that's very true. I think the division was between the reporters who were on the ground in Saigon and could see this stuff happening in real time, all the mistakes that Diem was making with the Buddhists, all the failures of his army in the field. They were reporting all that on a daily basis. That was right in front of them. And they had become, not only that, Diem's police were shadowing them and in a couple of cases beat up reporters on the street, smashed their cameras and so forth. And by the fall of '63, there was no love lost between the American reporters in Saigon and Diem. The people who were still, the journalists who were still pro-Diem at that point were the U.S.-based people like Marguerite Higgins, as you mentioned. She was a correspondent for the old New York Herald Tribune, very prominent, and Joe Alsop, who had his own column that was syndicated in hundreds of U.S. newspapers. And they supported Diem. They supported Nolting. They still thought that Diem could win the war, and they didn't hesitate to attack the Halberstams and the Neil Sheehan's in their writings and saying that they were excessively negative about the state of the war. They were misleading Kennedy and causing him to make policy mistakes, in turning against Diem and so forth. So they were very big. They were very influential actors in the whole thing.
So we got about a minute left, and I want to get to the big question in the room here. We talked a little bit about Kennedy's reaction. You wrote about how he spoke into his dictaphone in his office after the assassination, saying, we must bear a good deal of responsibility for this assassination. He was quite shook up. He told Kenneth O'Donnell, who was a good friend and his scheduling secretary, that he felt like, or he said he had no confidence the coup would not result in another repressive government in the not too distant future. Also talked to his advisors about taking a deep dive and review into why they were in Vietnam and whether the United States should get out of Vietnam. And this dovetails with a lot that Oliver Stone has written about over the years, this idea that Kennedy was going to get us out of the war in Vietnam. And in a sense, this assassination and his reaction to it had caused, such alarm for him that any misgivings he had about the war were exacerbated after this. Do you have any confidence, and I know I'm asking you a hypothetical here, but any confidence that the Kennedy that you saw in this book would have stood his ground and actually withdrew troops if things went sideways, which they did after the coup and assassination?
Well, so you're asking me to just walk into the very dangerous path of historical speculation, but I'm willing to do it. I think that Kennedy would have stuck to his guns. I think he told several people toward the end of his life that he wanted to get out of South Vietnam. He would have been reelected in '64 with a massive landslide. He would have had the political capital to start pulling U.S. forces out, U.S. personnel out. He was fully aware that the Republicans and the conservatives in Congress would have attacked him as an appeaser. That he was fully aware that he would have been labeled the Neville Chamberlain of 1964. But he was determined to do that. I mean, he would have been in his second and final term. So he wouldn't have had to bear a whole lot of immediate political consequences anyways. And not long before he was assassinated, he put out a press statement saying that he intended to start withdrawing U.S. combat advisors, that he was going to pull 1,000 advisors out of South Vietnam by the end of the year, and that he felt that the bulk of U.S. forces could be pulled out of South Vietnam by 1965. Now, would he have done that, facing some of the pressures that we discussed earlier that did face Lyndon Johnson in that era? Who knows? I think that Kennedy would have been much more flexible. He would have been much more determined to stay out of the war, to keep U.S. ground troops out of the war than Johnson was. Johnson's position was, I want to win the war. And his way of doing that was ramping up U.S. involvement in the war. I think Kennedy would have done everything in his power to stay out. And I think the theme he would have used was essentially the theme that Johnson used, which was, this is South Vietnam's war to win or lose. We can help them up to a certain point, but there's a red line, which is engaging our combat troops that I'm not going to cross. I mean, don't forget, this is exactly what Nixon did, and this is how he got us out of Vietnam in '69 through Vietnamization. That was just a euphemism for gradually pulling U.S. troops out of Vietnam and letting the South Vietnamese take over the war. Kennedy could have done the same thing.
We'll never know. He was assassinated 20 days later.
Right.
Jack, I wish we had another hour to talk. This is amazing. And thank you, Arturo, for your wonderful questions, probing questions. And for those on the call, please take a chance, order this book now. It just was released today. It's wonderful. We didn't get to even a surface level of unpacking it. And so please do that now. Also, for those who still on the call, we have a wonderful debate coming up for at the Quincy Institute on Thursday. So join us on Thursday. We have a debate between John Mearsheimer of the University of Chicago and the Quincy Institute's George Beebe on the question, is a peace agreement in Ukraine possible? This promises to be quite a riveting back and forth. It's going to be moderated by Emily Jashinsky, and it's at 11 a.m. Check out the Quincy Institute website, quincyinst.org, to register. And thanks again to my panelists and to a wonderful audience. Sorry we didn't get to all of your questions, but they were all fantastic. Thank you, and we'll see you soon.